Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be with you today. Today, we are going to be going over an article called Arctic Instincts by David Sun, which covers how Asians adapted to their local climate, or certain
Wow.
groups of Asians did, both
Right.
in terms of psychologically and in terms of other capacities. It's a spicy article. The guy who wrote it is Asian. So I don't know. I guess that can.
He gets a free pass.
Well, he was interested in studying, like, why are his people different from other people? Like, because, and specifically in the context of why are they different from other people in ways that Native Americans are also different from other people because they're closely related genetic groups.
Yeah, though of course implied differences on its own is terribly dangerous. So I get the controversy.
The paper has this big part at the beginning, which I'm taking out, where he's explaining that, he's been in academia for a while and he's been working on this for a while and he hasn't been able to publish it because he's afraid of losing his job. But now we're in, the new era, blah, blah, blah. And so it was in Aporia, obviously. Great paper. So let's go for it.
All right.
My paper falls within the discipline of cultural psychology, which seeks to understand people's culture and personality by examining the socio-ecological factors that they experienced over the past 10,000 years. Many interesting findings have already been made, as recent literature review documents. Population density predicts collectivism, tightness and future orientation, and frontier regions are characterized by individualism and high agency. So let's unpack every one of those. If historically, over the past 10 years, an area was really heavily populated, it is going to be more collectivistic, and people who are from that like genetic population are going to be more collectivistic because they would have, of course, succeeded at a higher rate within a dense area. So what regions would that be? Just, off the top of your head, you're probably thinking India, China. And then he's like, okay, and then you have the frontier regions, which are more associated with individualism and high agency. What are the biggest frontier area is obviously going to be the American West.
I was thinking like Mongolia, but sure. I mean, I think like Asian populations have seen a lot of both, which is interesting, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, no, Mongolia wouldn't really be. I can look at the way the paper looks at it, but if you're looking at selective pressures, the frontier regions that are opt-in frontier regions, rather than frontier regions you're just born into, are going to have a much higher genetic effect. Because if you talk about the American West, the reason why it's selected for individualism and agency at such a high level is, first, to immigrate to the United States to begin with as a population group, you have to have very high levels of agency. It's a very big decision. It's a very risky decision. And then these regions sorted for people who immigrated over, and then likely in multiple waves over multiple generations kept moving further west. Like, okay, well, we're in Boston now, but I don't like this. It's still too civilization-y. Let's go.
Too many people.
Let's go to the mountains of the Appalachians. Okay, I like it here. Oh, no, too many people are coming. Let's go further. Let's go all the way out to Texas. Let's go all the way out to, so it makes sense. And it also makes sense why that would give these regions some economic advantage over sort of global economies, because agency. There was one thing that you really pointed out to me recently, which is if you're talking about social status in the existing system, like global system, the one that we're entering into at least, it just seems to be a combination of IQ and agency and being agentic. And that's why it's so important, because you can't influence your kids' IQ that much, but you can, I believe, influence their level of agency.
100%. Though I'm sure there are genetic components there as well.
No, this is documenting that there's genetic components, and so what selects for them. I don't know. Tightness and future orientation is interesting. That's what you get in terms of heavily dense areas.
Yeah.
What does tightness mean in this context?
Yeah, tightness? Rigidity? Maybe the closeness of social relations? How internet a society is?
All right. So tightness refers to the degree to which a society has strict social norms.
Oh.
Tolerance for deviation in behavior. In a tight culture, there are strong social norms and little tolerance for behavior that deviates from these norms. Rules tend to be clearly defined and strictly enforced. There's a greater emphasis on conformity and social order. Punishment for violating norms is typically more severe. So these are in areas that are more populated. Makes sense that you would need stronger social cohesion in a place that's more populated, and you can have more diversity in a place that's less populated. Future orientation refers to the extent of cultural emphasizes planning for the future rather than focusing on immediate outcomes. High future orientation involves delaying gratification, prioritizing long-term planning and investment, emphasizing saving rather than immediate consumption, and valuing preparation and prevention. Interesting. So let's keep going here. Oh, by the way, the paper that he was read first thing, if anyone wants to look it up, is A Sociological Genetic Framework of Culture, Personality, Their Roots, Trends, and Interplay. And then he's saying frontier regions also have high pathogen prevalence predicts, and that then pathogen prevalence in a region over the past 10,000 years predicts collectivism, rice farming, and is associated with tightness and higher nepotism. Very interesting. You had higher nepotism in those regions. I suspect it's also pathogen prevalence would be highly tied to population as well. So it's probably also tied to the high population regions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The exact mechanisms by which sociological affects culture and personality are not always clear. They may be purely cultural. They may result from selective migration. They may be the product of natural selection acting on genes, or they may represent some mix, as in gene-cultural coevolution. However, humans did not parachute into their various homelands precisely 10,000 years ago. The 60,000-year migratory period that began when humans left Africa has been sorely neglected in human psychology. Ancient Siberian extreme cold adaptation is already frequently invoked to explain East Asian genomics and physiology. I therefore examined whether it could explain their culture and personality, and I found that it could. My paper documents that in terms of psychology, East Asians bear a striking resemblance to indigenous Inuit and Siberians. All three groups exhibit high emotional suppression, in-group cohesion, unassertiveness, introversion, indirectness, self-consciousness, self-sensitivity, cautiousness, perseverance, and visuospatial abilities, traits that would have enhanced their ancestors' survival in the unforgiving environment of Ice Age Siberia.
So these are not the things I would invest in a post-AI age, so this is making me nervous.
Yeah. That's a really good point. A lot of these just matter. Well, I mean, high emotional suppression should be generally a useful thing if you're able to do it.
Yeah, I would say in general, it's highly adaptive.
Direction.
Yes, yeah, that's the one thing for sure.
But outside of that, and keep in mind, they would have lower agenticness due to the other things he was mentioning. That is not great for a post-AI age. Like cautiousness and unassertiveness / introversion, indirectness, self-consciousness. Again, and I
think introversion doesn't help or hurt in an AI age, because I think extroversion actually is really for a pre-AI age. You need autistic, special interest, lopsided geniuses in a post-AI age who are very highly agentic and take a lot of initiative. Maybe a lot of that can be trained, like to your point, right? This is also a population that on average is known for higher levels of intelligence, at least in some domains. So maybe they can leverage that, which is more, we would posit genetic, and teach more agentic behavior and patterns.
Yeah, and I would say that these stereotypes that he's pulling up here fit my lived experience of interacting with various ethnic groups. So I don't think that he's wrong to make these assertions. And again, he is Asian making these assertions about Asians. I particularly note the unassertiveness I've mentioned before, but I can think of very few Asians I know who like arguing for the sake of arguing, which is rare in our social circles, because most people in like conservative intellectual social circles like arguing for the sake of arguing. Brian Chow does not like arguing for the sake of arguing.
He loves debating. He loves bringing up subjects. He loves talking about controversial things. What's the difference between that and arguing?
That's very different than like, okay, think of like the way a Jewish person would debate, where they like really want to persuade you of their perspective. Like,
like winning for them matters. Whereas like Brian is just expressing the truth as he sees it.
Brian is expressing the truth, and he finds it odd that you don't see the truth.
Yeah, like, what are you missing, you sad idiot? Versus like, I've got to convince. Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, not in a derogatory way, but
no.
But definitely the weight when he has a difference of opinion is very different than the way that Jews or Catholics, when they debate, have differences of opinion. When I think about these groups. And not that Asians can't be Catholics. I'm just, thinking here the way that I like subdivide populations, because we argue, as anyone who reads this podcast, that this past, like, I'd say 500 years of someone's evolutionary history is way more important than the
previous 20,000 years.
The previous 20,000 years or 60,000 years.
Right. Because I mean, small bottlenecks and evolutionary pressures can make a huge difference. I mean, you could have, huge swaths of a population die off just to I mean, who knows how different the European population is post-plague? Like, who knows what other traits got wiped out with susceptibility to the plague?
Yeah.
And who knows what traits got suddenly skyrocketed because they correlated with whatever it was that made some people immune. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is why when I'm looking at genetic groups, I typically do not look at ethnicities, but I look at religions because I think that they're more predictive of personality. And yeah, that's just where I disagree with this, but I do agree with everything he's saying here. So, and I think it works. And with Asian populations, they haven't been susceptible to multiple religious frameworks that genetically isolated them in the same way Europeans have. So there isn't a reason to that way. Anyway, my paper documents that in terms of psychology, oh no, I already read that. Okay. My paper also documents that Arctic environments necessitate these very traits in polar workers and expeditioners. Scouting the literature on personal psychology revealed that the relevant traits are so consistently predictive of success in polar environments that they have been refined into the personal selection criteria for many countries' polar research programs. Here we see human selection conveniently mirroring natural selection. That's really fascinating.
Wow.
What are polar environments like? Basically, all the threats that the typical hunter-gatherers face are exacerbated in Arctic, where the average temperature is lethally cold, the visual landscape is blank and featureless, the ecology is devoid of vegetation, and where the ground might suddenly collapse underneath you or drift away via ice flow. Mistakes are very severely punished by the environment. Meanwhile, poor visuospatial ability, lack of group cohesion, or reckless emotional behavior can be instantly fatal for the group. You know, it's interesting that he notes the reckless emotional behavior because in Arctic communities, there was this form of madness where people would like, and this was an Inuit community specifically. So like these ethnic groups where people would like freak out and like start murdering people or like run
What?
around screaming or like,
Really? Where did you hear about? I've never heard of this before. This is crazy.
yeah, it's a study.
Is it like like cabin fever essentially?
Yeah, it's a culture-bound cabin fever unique to these
Oh.
regions. I collected in an episode I was going to do on cultural-bound illnesses,
Did
but
it
we're not.
happen like during the darkest parts of the winter when people are really, really, really
No,
stuck
what's
inside?
interesting about it is we're not sure if it's a real behavior or it was something that was
Oh.
being caused by the researchers in some way.
Oh
Um,
wow, like right, like fan death and penis stealing, where people it was like a shared delusion that because people said it was real, it became real. That
yeah,
kind of thing.
the researchers somehow made it real for short periods of time where data was being collected.
I see. Okay. Wow. That's wild. Terrifying.
Frequent blizzards and lethal windstorms necessitate prolonged group confinement, traditionally in igloos or tents, now in small polar stations. Indoor adaptive changes include staying emotionally stable, controlling aggressive impulses, and being able to complete complex tasks in extremely adverse conditions.
Hmm.
As evacuation is not possible during deep winter, and
Yeah.
social expulsion into the outdoors is fatal. A recent news story about a South African scientist trapped in Antarctica with a violent team member illustrates the importance of adaptive traits listed earlier.
Oh gosh.
That's
Nightmare scenario. I was just thinking about this documentary that I watched on giving birth in these environments, which oh my gosh. No. But
but,
that
but think
next
about it.
level.
Think about like the argument trait I was just noticing before.
Right. Yeah.
Not getting into heated arguments with people is going
Yeah.
to be
Being very avoidant with arguments. Let's
is going to be
go.
very important if you're in an environment like this where being expelled gets you killed. Same with
Yeah.
being, not aggressive or not overly pushy about your opinions or perspectives, which I hadn't considered, but he's absolutely right. That would have had a really strong genetic effect.
Yeah.
Anyone who at any point during the winter pissed off anyone enough that they needed to be in two separate rooms was removed from the gene pool.
Yeah. Because it was just that deadly in those close quarters with
Yeah.
nowhere to run or hide. I guess in a temperate climate, even if your entire tribe kicked you out, you could theoretically survive foraging and hunting and fishing.
Yeah.
Not here.
Yeah. Those traits, which are shared by East Asians and the Inuit and polar workers of all ethnicities, appear to be critical for staying alive and accomplishing tasks in the harsh Arctic environments.
Hmm.
This provided the basis for a parsimonious Arctivism theory of East Asian psychology, which posits that psychological adaptations to Ice Age Siberia predate and likely influence later ideologies like Confucianism. And so here he has like a little chart where he shows how this works. And he's like, OOA, I don't know what that's, out of Africa. And then you have the Arabian standstill. So the southern route, tropical South Asia and subtropical East Asia, and the temperate mixed range Eurasia, pre-LGM mammoth steppe. And then you have this period here where they antagonized by Inuit, replicated in modern polar person. Sorry, not antagonized. Analogized by Inuit and replicated in modern polar personnel, intensified harmony and cohesion, emotional suppression, perseverance, blah, blah, blah. Multi-crop rice farming and agricultural Japanese natural disasters further intensifies collectivism. Xi Zhang's dynasty's values, Confucianism. You get harmony, cohesion, emotional suppression, perseverance. And then you have Taoism, Shintoism, Tenggrianism, Korean Shamanism, holism, animism, harmony, balance. Values. Interesting. Anything you want to say before I go further?
No, I want to hear more.
Archetypism theory has already yielded some successful predictions, such as the observation that East Asian polar explorers have had an easier time and are more psychologically stable than their North American counterparts.
Oh, really? Like someone systematically measured this? And how do you even measure it? Like number of discoveries, progress made before they die?
It was a study called Psychological Adjustment during 3 Japanese Antarctic research expeditions.
Okay.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you only hear the documentaries about English guys for the most part, but I guess that's because we're...
Yeah, they say the psychological profile of the subjects was relatively stable and comparable to the standard means of Western sojourners. The results showed the subjects were generally high in stress resistance.
I don't know, pretty much anyone who opts into that. I feel like the selective pressures of just being an Arctic researcher are going to select for people who are very rugged and patient.
Was saying that they were relatively more so than the Westerners who did the same thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, another successful prediction is that in Singapore, East Asians have significantly lower rates of claustrophobia than South and Southeast Asians, when accounting for national culture and farming ancestry.
That's so interesting. So this whole shoving people onto the peak commute hour subway in Japan thing, I mean, they were designed for it. That was meant to happen.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you make. Actually, hold on. Side theory. Side theory here.
Okay.
It goes urbanization, because of these traits, happened at a much higher rate in these cultures.
Like they just didn't viscerally feel uncomfortable with it. So they didn't need to spread out as much because they
didn't need to spread out, which allowed for these ultra dense cities. Because I was just thinking, like, I think most Westerners, if they were like in one of those trains where like everybody's like crowded and shoved on,
or one of those micro apartments, you've seen them in Tokyo and Beijing.
Well, I'm just thinking the trains themselves. Most Westerners would just be like, I need to get out of here. Like, I can't live with this. And when I think about the regions of the world where you see these ultra dense trains, like you see this in India, you know, those pictures you see of India where it's like people like hanging.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, they are from areas that had really high population density, historically speaking, and potentially went through an Arctic period in their migratory patterns. I don't know if Indians did they?
No, not at all. So what's up? That must be a totally separate evolutionary pressures. But yeah, I wonder what drove population density in India, where it's not necessarily then a must-have, right? I mean, there's
well, I mean, Indian populations have been really heavily influenced by the caste system. They are, due to the caste system, as genetically different from each other as people from like Denmark are from people from Greece. And to be clear, like that's really big genetic difference. Like even at like the sociological level, for people who have done much traveling in those two countries, the Greek have a quite different, like if you think of them as broadly European, they have a quite different perspective than you think like you get from Northern Europeans.
Yeah.
And so I think within India, a lot of it has been, psychological differences that are the result of the environment have been partially hidden by psychological differences that were driven by caste systems. And in the United States, the problem that you have when you're building stereotypes around Indians is that you are predominantly going to be interacting with Brahmins, or just like way more than you would if you were in India. I can't remember what it was. I guess like 25% of Indian immigrants or something.
Yeah.
So it really heavily affects the way that they act.
Yeah.
Anyway, I plan to test novel predictions in future studies by comparing Mongolians to Cossacks, Berbers, and Somalis, thereby controlling for Holocene pastoralism, and by comparing Southern Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans to Malays, Indians, and Northern Italians, thereby controlling for Holocene rice farming.
Oh.
Methods of study. Cultural psychologists must expand their scope of inquiry beyond just the Holocene and all the way back to 70,000 years ago when humans left Africa. I have dubbed
Okay.
this approach the total evolutionary ecologies TEE model. The idea being that to understand a local population, one must examine all the environments and selective pressures their ancestors faced instead of arbitrarily limiting oneself to the Holocene. It seems obvious in hindsight, but prior research advances in archaeogenetics and paleoecology, the pre-Holocene period was mostly hand waved away by psychologists due to lack of data, methods. So it's really interesting to me the way that he is doing this is he is looking for different populations that experienced one historic ecology but not another. So he's like, okay, what populations experienced the same, pre-Holocene environment and a different post-Holocene environment, and see if they have any traits that are similar across them. And can we sort of look at like what specifically these post-Holocene environments are adding and what the pre-Holocene environments are adding? Obviously, his TEE model works very different from our model. Our model is that the vast majority, I'm going to say like 80% of psychological effects from evolution occur within the past 1,000 years, and I would weight them to the past 500 years.
I'm with you on that.
And it's just because when you have migration, now this again is uniquely true. When I should say that my theory is really focused on the United States because that's where I live. And that's where migration was going to play a really big role in genetic sorting. So, if I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this, if you look at Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley genetically and culturally seems to have produced a hugely disproportionate amount of global innovation over the past 50 years. I don't think anyone like nothing even comes close. And so the question is, okay, well, what were the recent evolutionary pressures for migration or disproportionate migration to the Silicon Valley region historically? Well, what you had was first you could say, well, what led to Silicon Valley? Well, it was really high risk-taking behavior for high risk, high reward potential payoffs. The Silicon Valley area was historically settled during the gold mine rush, the what were they called, the 49ers. And that was a complete population that was just like, we're going to go to this region based on high risk, high reward potential outcomes. And that's what drew the seed population there, which made the population one both more high risk, high reward, but in line with also expeditionary forces and what's the word I'm looking for here, regions of high frontier regions, like basically an ultra frontier region, which also meant that they were more okay with cultural diversity and had less cultural tightness. And you can see this within the culture of that region, the hippie movement, etc. It's not just like the modern iterations of like proto woke culture or proto like cults forming there all the time. This is where Simone's ancestors migrated to, by the way, so you can see your ancestors who would have migrated to that region would have had much more of these high risk, high reward traits than people in the regions where they already were. And they were already in frontier regions when they made this migration. You're
Right.
Chicago, the Great Plains, etc.
Yeah.
Any thoughts before I go further?
I mean, I'd also point out, like, when you're looking at people who migrated to America before 1850, you're already getting people who are extremely risk-taking. I mean, just getting on one of those boats to cross the Atlantic is huge.
Yeah,
risk,
one of the things I point out is a lot of people don't realize, even when things were like horrifyingly bad, I point this out was the Irish, and they had the coffin ships.
They're like, I'm not getting on that boat.
The US, and like half the people would be dead. Well,
I'm
yeah,
gonna
but
chance it with this starvation here.
a lot of people would die on the boats.
Yes, they did. Yes.
And so even coming over was like months was dead bodies. But
I think they threw them overboard, but yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of people, even when their tickets were paid for, the reason why a lot of Irish who stayed in Ireland was not that they didn't have the money to leave during the famine. It was that they just refused to leave because a lot of the landlords in Ireland offered to pay for them to leave, and they said, "No, I won't." I know as to why the evil landlords, offered to pay for them to leave is because they kept forming gangs when the landlords couldn't pay them, the people on his property, and killing the landlords. And so the landlords wanted to lower the number of people.
Yeah, they didn't want that social unrest. No one wants starving people with no work on their land. That's
Yeah,
really scary.
especially when the people are expecting you to pay them.
Yeah, that's no, you're going to do a lot to get them out, and yet, and I don't blame these people, but I want to highlight the fact that when you look at people who migrated to the West after 1850, you already have some very intense risk takers, and then they're like people now who are clearly addicted to risk and who just can't stand being around other people. So you've got this hyper selective series of events, and I think you see this around the world with a lot of different populations.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of like the Irish immigration wave, and we did our video, The Great Replacement has already happened, on the various Catholic immigration waves, the Irish and the Italian immigration wave, and point out that this was just not a large population in the United States pre these waves. At the time of the Revolution, they only made up 1.5% of the population Catholics. And even in the Catholic state, Maryland, they were only 10%. But I think an interesting point here, I've gone over this with you before, but an interesting point here is I actually think, culturally speaking, the pressures that led to the Irish and Italian immigration wave cause the American descendants of these two groups to be, I would argue, the most culturally distinct American group, more distinct than the Hispanic American immigrants, which are actually, I'd say, closer in personality and proclivities to the OG Americans, largely because they are immigrating from countries where the immigrant waves to those countries mirrored the immigrant waves to the United States. Immigrating to America versus immigrating to Mexico historically versus immigrating to, one of the South American colonies historically, not that different from immigrating to the United States. You had to be like really risk-taking. Whereas the Irish and the Italian immigration waves, they were basically forced out of their country by extreme poverty.
Yeah, it was more of a refugee situation, and not it was reactive, not proactive.
Yes, they were refugees more than voluntary immigrants. And so they maintained a lot more of their historic culture.
Yeah.
And that's
why I think looking at the why behind selective pressures is important, because just migrating, just going through a certain environment doesn't explain all of it.
Yeah. And that's why they disproportionately hold positions within bureaucratic organizations in the United States. We pointed this out before, the Irish and Italian descendants disproportionately, if you're looking at like lawyers, judges, the Supreme Court, if you're looking at the government agencies, police forces, historically, they were famously like overly Irish or overly Italian. Which is really interesting. And, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. Like, I'm not saying them being different from other American populations. It's just interesting to me, the reactive freak out Americans have to the Hispanic immigration waves, which, like the Irish and Italian, are Catholic waves, but they're not, they're chosen immigrant populations. They're not like refugee populations. Anyway, to continue. Evolutionary psychology traditionally had all the limitations of historical science. There was no time machine one could use to go back to the Pleistocene Africa to observe the long process of natural and sexual selection for universal human cognitive mechanisms. There was also no way to get a control group and an experimental group, as the process of universal human evolution takes far too long, although Janet Song's lab is doing some interesting work on genetic brain evolution. These limitations apply far less to the TEE model. That is, when investigating psychological traits that represent local adaptations to environments humans have inhabited since we left Africa. Ironically, then, the most taboo area of cultural psychology is the most empirically robust. Take my analysis of personal psychology data. Here we do have the luxury of control groups and experimental groups, civilians, pre-winter personnel versus polar veterans, post-winter personnel. This allows us to track psychological changes throughout a winter over a polar trek, and then use the resulting success and failures to learn about the processes of natural selection in the past. Although some expeditioners actually die or get severely injured, most failures in evacuation or being rated low by peers and supervisor. Polar psychologists have also conducted extensive psychological testing of personnel, and by using the traits to predict success and failures, they have identified successful selection criteria for polar candidates. This has greatly enhanced our understanding of the kinds of personalities a polar environment select for. So interesting, because a lot of times, this is just like just so stuff. This is just theorizing. This is how it's thought of as the outside. And now that we're reopening this area of potential investigation, I think we can learn really interesting things about ourselves. The interesting thing is I think that when a lot of people hear about people doing work on like, why do certain groups have certain traits, what they think is that the primary motivation to do this is going to be to learn about outgroups, i.e., and to categorize outgroups in ways that are potentially deleterious, i.e., let's say like white people doing like race science on like black people, when in reality, the most curiosity and most benefit from this is going to come from the groups themselves. This guy is Asian and he wants to understand like, why am I like this? Why are Asians like this, disproportionately speaking? That would be interesting for me to understand, because in understanding that, I understand myself better. If you look at the types of research that we do obsessively here, we focus much more on our cultural group, the greater Appalachian cultural group that we both come from, than other cultural groups. Like hugely disproportionately, we talk and research and investigate our own culture because it is more interesting to us than other cultures.
Yeah, and what are we supposed to do about other people's cultures, groups that we don't have any say in, are not part of, can't contribute to?
Well, they can be interesting to understand American trends, and trends in American politics and the electorate and everything.
And you can learn about pitfalls to try to avoid or replicate. Yeah, but I mean, for the most part, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that understanding distinctions, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, distinctions like the when you think about the American Republican or Southerner or rural person, right? The two large groups or three large groups hit this: the greater Appalachian cultural group, the far west cultural or the Western frontier cultural group, and the Cavalier cultural group. And many people confuse the Cavalier cultural group with the Appalachian cultural group as a single culture, when they are like radically different from each other in almost every single metric. And I would say this as having a family where I come from the faction of the family that married into other greater Appalachian cultural group people, and then other people in my family married into the Cavalier cultural group, and the cultural expectations of these groups are radically different. The Cavalier cultural group is very obsessed with manners, being gentlemanly, proper form, doing aristocratic looking things. Like they spend a lot of money on like country
clubs, boats.
Although the faction that you're thinking of, the boats faction, they married into.
They're super waspy. I don't know. I think they're more Boston Brahmins than anything else. They're not exactly.
Yeah, but
they're not either.
But just like when I look at my family, the biggest cultural friction is between the Cavalier aristocratic deep South culture and genetic selection events and the backwoods, like F you to authority, like I don't care what anyone has to say, like I'm gonna live my way cultural group. And I wouldn't say that this is like an active or hot conflict. It's just like in terms of preferences, they find the way that we act to be very strange and sometimes even inscrutable, especially given that we have all of the shibboleths we need to be accepted by aristocratic society. I've got a Stanford MBA, you've got a Cambridge graduate degree. Like, why are we going out there saying stuff and talking in a way and calling people retards if that's one, it's not a proper thing to do.
Yeah.
But I will say I do appreciate, and you should see our video on why people have manners. I do appreciate, and one thing I did take from their group was manners in interacting with women. I was like, this is actually a thing of value that I should make a point of learning and remembering.
You mean in that, I don't remember this episode, it would give our sons a competitive advantage in the dating world? Because it totally would.
Yeah, well, it's a competitive advantage in the dating world. People actually do appreciate and notice good manners, especially
100%. Well, they show inhibitory control and self-discipline. They show that you are capable of delaying in the moment gratification and or a desire for laziness or energy conservation in favor of making other people comfortable. Because in the end, etiquette is about making for smooth social transactions and making other people comfortable.
But doing it in a way that also other you, I think is really important. I think a lot of people drop manners when manners start to other them. It's something that I, was taught to me as a kid by this cultural group is no, that's when it's most important to have manners. Although, I mean, I don't follow manners as strictly as they do. For example, they will, when a woman gets up to like use the restroom or leave the table,
They'll stand up. Yeah.
And I think that that's just a little too much for me. I've never
You can't
really
handle it.
got into it.
Malcolm, you can't even use silverware at a restaurant. I think, and that's an interesting thing, is that you were essentially trained in boarding school to not show manners because I don't know, that lowered your status in middle school. So now you literally, instead of using a knife, use your freaking forefinger to move food around on a plate at fancy restaurants. Oh.
Do I destroy you? But I will strive to have better manners. Are you going to teach our kids manners?
Yes, of course I am.
So
hey, look, both our sons are already like, where am I going to find a wife? I want a wife. Part of it's because they really want rings. Like they're very inquisitive little covetous dragons and they want rings. And we're like, well, you get a ring when you get married. And they're like, how do I get married? Well, you have to find a wife. Well, where do I find a wife? I'll never find a wife.
They're also really obsessed with having kids, not because of our prenatalist talk. And I realize that this likely affects how many kids people have severely, but because they are in a family where Simone's like always pregnant or has a baby, and they see you focusing on the baby, and then their caregivers who they stay with during the day were recently pregnant and had a baby.
I think it's also just kind of a cool superpower that like, oh, women can 3D print humans. And therefore Octavian says that women are better because they can.
Because I only like women.
Yeah, I only like women. I'm the king of all women, he told me one day.
What did he say?
I'm the king of all women. He just
I was there when he said that. That was so funny. He goes, he was talking about a woman that he thought was attractive, humorously, his teacher, the way young kids are. He's like, oh, is that Mrs. Whatever? I don't know. And I was like, and then he looks for a bit and he answers himself. He goes, no, she doesn't have beautiful enough hair. And then he's continuing to think for his, he goes, Mrs. Whatever has very long and beautiful hair. And then he stops and he thinks for a bit. He goes, I'm the king of all women. That was what he said, right? Like that was the chain of.
Yeah.
I so wish I could have gotten it on video. It was so hilarious. I am the king of all women.
Once he has manners, he will be. We'll see.
But I also love the way that I can so see one of these like, groups that tries to like target kids for transition in school because he's autistic and everything, targeting him. And he's like, okay, so I'm gonna be able to have babies, right? Like that's the point of being a woman. He's gonna so trigger someone who's gonna be like, well, no, I mean, there's other reasons to be a woman other than have kids. He's gonna be like, no, there isn't. No, there is not one. He's like, if I become a woman, because he knows he needs to get a woman to make kids.
Mm-hmm.
That's like,
which is very important to him. Yeah, he wants to.
He's thinking right now.
Yeah.
He'll be a ladies' man though. He looks like the type of kid who's going to grow up to be very attractive.
Already, all of his friends in class are girls who really like him. So
yeah, that's what they told us on the school call.
Yeah.
But I don't think how a guy's going to do with girls until girls start going through puberty, because girls go through puberty before guys do. So then you can be like, okay, is he still interacting in this? He's very like obsessed with like being the good guy and like keeping order. So I can see that looking good to some females. We'll see. I have a question for you. Growing up, did you ever notice cultural differences because you had a very like ethnically immigration-y diverse group of friends living in the Bay Area, in the Asian friends you had versus the other friends?
Yeah, did I notice cultural differences? Not really. It's more that I noticed there were some friends maybe who were either less integrated than others or just from weirder, or I don't know how to say it, more strict families than others. So there was one girl in my middle school or high school class who was just like, yeah, my mom tells me she doesn't love me. Like just actively, like not even tiger momming, just being like, yeah, I don't love you. And that was really hard for me to understand. There was another Korean girl who was very, very clingy and very, very Christian and extremely docile. So like that came across as sort of weird and different. But then a bunch of my other Chinese and Vietnamese friends were just super normal and fun and like a little quirky maybe, but like I was a little quirky too. And my other European descent friends were also quirky. So it's weird that there wasn't, like, yeah, my Asian friends on average are like this, or like my Korean versus Chinese versus Filipino versus Vietnamese friends are like this and this and this and this. There really wasn't much of that. And there were very different degrees of parental involvement between families. But definitely you know how in childhood cartoons, like parents just aren't there, and a lot of them it's just like, what parents? They're just never
Yeah.
there. Like there's scenes at the kid's home and just there's no parent. That was kind of how it was with my Asian friends. I barely, if ever, met their parents, which was really weird because I spent a lot of time with them and sometimes even went to their house.
Yeah.
Whereas with my Western descent friends, parents were just there all the time, like in Mean
Yeah, we
Girls,
mentioned
like
this
the mother
before.
who's just like, oh, how you doing?
Hey, 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 how are my best girlfriends?
Hey, Mrs. George. This is Katie.
Hello, sweetheart. Hi. Welcome to our home. I just want you to know, if you need anything, don't be shy, okay? There are no rules in this house.
Hey, you guys. Happy hour is from 4 to 6.
Is there alcohol in this?
Oh, God, honey, no. What kind of mother do you think I am? Why do you want a little bit? Because if you're going to drink, I'd rather you do it in the house.
No, thank you.
So, you guys, what is the 411? What has everybody been up to? What is the hot gossip?
Like,
But I mean, when
bringing
you talk
snacks.
about cultural differences that are going to lead to differences in adulthood, like this is obviously going to have a big effect.
Parental involvement.
Yeah, well, and the ways that parents have involvement, is it, about sitting down with a kid during time that's just parent kid time, or are they bringing the kid along with them during their regular daily routine? These are two. If you look historically at the different American styles of parenting, the backwoods Greater Appalachian region, the way that parental involvement worked is the kids would follow the parent around, whereas if you go to the Puritan or Quaker regions, it was more that the parent would set aside like unique time to interact with the kid, which is a very different way of interacting with people depending on the region.
Yeah, like this is my dedicated kid time.
Was that the way it worked with your parents, or were they more like just follow me around on when I'm doing business and work? And
They referred to it as parallel play, and I loved it, which is just we all kind of ignored each other and did our own thing, but in close proximity. So yeah, it would be that Appalachian model of like, I'm going to do my work or do my thing.
they also brought you on lots of business trips, as I remember.
Yeah, I loved that. That was great. Yeah, which I guess is very much that Appalachian model.
Yeah, and then they just let you do whatever when you were in these countries. Just
yeah, I would wander the streets of Tokyo, but then sometimes I would come along to business dinners and see drunken salarymen sing karaoke and eat all their Kobe beef.
But I think we've really hurt society when progressives like tried to prevent us from looking at these differererences. I think there's just so much we can learn, both about ourselves and about how other people have different perspectives than us and what might be driving those perspectives by looking at things like child rearing. That would actually be a great episode for me to research, is a child rearing episode.
Yeah, of like cultural differences in child rearing, because again, like at least the averages or cultural norms of, we'll say, Chinese investment in children, it's kind of heartbreakingly high, but in this kind of remote way, like that allegedly 60% of disposable income goes to rearing kids once a Chinese couple has kids. Also, in all the manga that I'd read, about kids maybe being stressed out at school or studying, it wasn't like the parents were like sitting there next to them. It was they would come home from school and go upstairs to their room and study by themselves and then come down to eat dinner as a family, sure. But there wasn't a whole lot of side-by-side parent time spent. That was relegated mostly to meals, which is interesting because in that way, the parents are breaking their backs raising their kids, but not really getting to enjoy them, which might have a very antenatal effect. Like, what's the point? This isn't even fun. I'm spending all my time to basically contribute to an investment asset that I'm not even enjoying, especially in societies where less and less so you're depending on your children for retirement. What would the point be at all? You don't hang out with your kids. You don't really like them. You're really stressed out about their achievement. You spend a ton of money on them. Yeah, I'm not signing up for that. That sounds terrible. I'm not doing that.
That is really interesting. It reminds me of, they were talking about how in one article I was reading, how cultures, you typically either go to live with like the mother's family or the father's family, depending on what culture you're talking
Oh,
about.
you mean like if the married couple collectively will go live with them?
And
Okay.
a cultural trait that you see when you go to live with the mother's family is typically women are a lot more agentic in these cultures and have much higher status, and that the rural British culture, which informed a lot of American culture, was one of these. And that's why in a lot of old-timey stuff people talk about the old battle axe mother-in-law is such a frequent trope, because these people were literally living alongside the young couple. Like they were going to live in the girl's parents' house. And so the mother-in-law would exert a lot of influence that could really chafe on, the young couple. And that makes perfect sense. But you'd also get this trope of, they have so much cultural power and pressure. Anyway, I love you to death, Simone. What am I having for dinner tonight?
So we could do more curry, but we've been doing a lot of that lately. I know I need to make something new for you, but you don't like Dan noodles anymore, and you don't like Sichuan chicken anymore. And I used to like pot stickers, which I can make for you. What kind of tickles your fancies these days? Used to like even just random grilled cheese nights. You'd be like, yeah, let's do grilled cheese, but that's too basic for you. What do I do?
Or something, or chicken, or we could do. I mean, why don't you like look at some of the sauces that we haven't been using, and then ask an AI what can be made from them.
Okay. Do you know which sauce made your tummy hurt?
No, we don't know yet.
So
but we can look at the ones that we're not using now. So what I would do is I would look in the fridge and be like, okay. Like, I know we got some Thai red chili sauce or something that we haven't really used on anything.
Oh, we have a lot of gochujang sauce. So.
Well, you could do something with gochujang that is not gochujang chicken. I mean, I would just put gochujang in other dishes. I don't think that like... Oh, what's that dish you did where you made the fiery chicken? I like that one. It was like a drier chicken dish.
I think you're thinking of gochujang chicken. That's first breaded in...
No, not breaded chicken. It was like a drier chicken dish.
Yeah, pretty much all of the ones are first dipped in cornstarch and then fried.
Well, why don't you try to just make up your own dish?
Because with the limited amount of time I've gotten to prepare dinner, I can't do that except for on a weekend, maybe.
Okay, then just give me, dumplings. Okay, I don't care.
Okay, we can plan something better tomorrow. If I make more, I just need preparation time. I need to have the ingredients necessary.
Well, I mean, you're gonna get like an hour of preparation time today.
No, because we're gonna. Well, maybe we'll see. We'll see.
All right, I'll hop on the other call. Love you.
Looking forward to it. Ending recording.
I was in the middle of watching that amazing link you sent about Hitoshi having to explain we had an Italian journalist team staying at our house this last weekend, and I had to spend a long time explaining to them why what was his name? The prime minister, what is it?
Oh my gosh.
Shinzo Abe, that's what it was. Shinzo Abe. But anyway, so I had to explain to them why Shinzo Abe, how he saved Trump. And they're like, do people like actually believe this happened? And I was like, well, I mean, they emotionally believe it happened, and that's what matters.
Great way of putting it. Great. Perfect.
I did it. I climbed up.
Be careful.
I mean to climb.
Well, Toasty, that is way too close to the edge. Way too close.
I want to climb. I need to get that rock.
So you got to get more rocks, Toasty.
More rocks. But there's okay. Mommy, I'm doing it. But I need to climb. But I mean, I'm going to climb.
Toasty, come back over here and I'll hold you up, okay? And I'll get you 2 Titan.